All right, let's talk about something that happens to every single chess player out there. You're looking at a board, it's just a total mess of pieces, and you have absolutely no idea what's going on or what you're supposed to do next. Today, we're going to show you how to cut right through that confusion and see the game like a pro. Ready to take your chess to a whole new level? Let's do this.
You know the feeling, right? You're in a super tense mid-game, your opponent makes a move, and it feels like it came from another planet. Suddenly, all your brilliant plans are just dust. You're scrambling, trying to figure out where it all went wrong, but you're so caught up in the immediate little threats that you completely miss the big picture. You've spent 10 minutes worrying about some obvious knight fork, only to realize the real killer was that quiet little bishop sitting all the way across the board, controlling everything. It's an awful feeling, but it's one we can definitely learn to avoid. But hey, don't worry, we're not going to leave you hanging. We've got a roadmap. In this explainer, we're giving you a step-by-step guide to reading the board like you've got X-ray vision. We'll kick things off with the absolute basics, the alphabet of chess, if you will. And then we'll get into the really cool stuff, the advanced thinking that Grandmasters use. I promise, by the end of this, you'll see the game in a completely new light. Okay, let's dive right in. Look, before you can read the story that a chess game is telling, you have to know the language. And these days, that language is universal. It's the key that unlocks basically everything. All the books, all the videos, all the databases full of amazing games that are going to help you get better. You know, for a long time, people use this thing called descriptive notation. You'd hear moves like knight to king's bishop 3. Sounds kind of old-timey, right? Well, the problem was the name of a square actually changed depending on whose turn it was. So white's king's bishop 3 was a totally different square from black's king's bishop 3. It was just a mess. Super confusing. That's why the whole chess world, thankfully, switched to algebraic notation. It's clean, it's simple, and this is the big one, it's totally unambiguous. Every single square has one unique name, like F3, and it doesn't matter if you're playing white or black, it's the global standard for a really good reason. So once we're all speaking the same language, how do we start to understand what's actually being said on the board? What we need is a system. And luckily for us, Grandmaster Noel Studer came up with this brilliant framework that acts like a compass. No matter how wild and crazy a position gets, this compass can guide you right to the heart of what's truly going on. These are the 5 things you need to look at in every single position. But here's the crucial part. The order is everything. This isn't just a random checklist you can jump around on, it's a hierarchy, it's a pyramid. Most players, and I mean most of us when we're starting out, make the huge mistake of starting with number 2, material. We just count the pieces. But you're about to see that's often the least important thing on this list. The first thing you should always look at is king safety. Everything else flows from that. So, let's start at the very top of that pyramid. The first question you have to burn into your brain, the question you ask before anything else is, whose king is safer? Because let's be honest, nothing else matters if your king is about to be checkmated. The great Grandmaster Nigel Short said it best, checkmate ends the game. That's it. You can be up a queen, you can have the most beautiful pawn structure anyone's ever seen, but if your king is trapped, none of it means a thing. Game over. This right here is the anchor for your entire thought process. So, how do you actually figure out whose king is safer? Well, you're basically like a detective, asking a series of key questions. Is a king stuck out in the middle of the board, or is it tucked away safely behind a wall of pawns? Does it have any bodyguards, like a knight nearby? How many enemy pieces are pointing in its direction? The more of these questions you can answer in your favor, the safer your king is. And this leads to a really simple but powerful rule of thumb. If your king is the one in danger, you should be trying to trade pieces. If your opponent's king is the one in trouble, you want to keep as many of your attackers on the board as you possibly can. Let's look at an all-time classic example to see this in action. This is a famous game between 2 absolute legends, Nigel Short and John Timman. Now, if you just glance at this position, you might think white's king is in a world of hurt. It's kind of out in the open, seems like black's pieces are closing in. But looks can be deceiving, can't they? If you really look closely, you realize black's king is the one that's in mortal danger. It's trapped on the back rank, and all of white's pieces are pointed at it like a bunch of laser beams. And because his own king was basically invincible and black's king was on the verge of collapse, Nigel Short did something totally legendary, something that people still talk about today. He realized his king didn't need to hide, it could be an attacker. He played kg2, then kg3, then kf4, kg5, and finally, all the way up to h6. The king itself marched up the board like a general, leading the charge to deliver the final blow. It's just a beautiful illustration of what's possible when you have the safer king. It gives you the freedom to be incredibly creative.
Okay, so only after we've figured out who has the safer king do we move on. The next two factors on our compass, material and piece activity, you really have to think about them together. This is where we stop being just bean counters and start thinking like a true military strategist.
Think about it like this. The material on the board, your rooks, your knights, your bishops, that's your army's potential power. But piece activity? That's what your army is actually doing in the real world. A rook on the back rank is worth 5 points on paper, sure. But if it's stuck behind its own pawns and can't move, its real value is basically 0. The source material has this great analogy from ice hockey. Being a player up is a huge advantage, right? But if that extra player is on the complete wrong side of the rink when the other team has a breakaway, they're totally useless. For that moment in time, the team with fewer players is actually stronger. It's the exact same idea in chess.
So we've covered the really explosive, dynamic parts of a position. But what about the more permanent stuff? The long-term strategic features that can define a game for dozens of moves? Well, that's where pawn structure and space come into the picture.
People often call the pawn structure the skeleton of a position, and that's a perfect description. See, a piece can go from being super active to totally passive in just one move. But a weak pawn structure, things like doubled pawns stacked on top of each other, or an isolated pawn with no friends to help it, that's a problem that can haunt you for the entire game. You can't just move pawns backward to fix a mistake. These weaknesses might not seem like a big deal in a complicated middle game, but boy, do they become decisive once you get to an endgame. And finally, we get to space. This one's pretty easy to feel. The side that controls more of the board, that has more space, well, their pieces just have more room to breathe. Their knights can jump to better squares, their bishops have these beautiful open diagonals. The side with less space feels totally cramped, like their pieces are tripping over each other. And this leads to another simple but super powerful rule. If you're the one being squeezed, you should try to trade pieces. Fewer pieces on the board means more breathing room. But if you're the one with all the space, you should avoid trades at all costs and use that advantage to slowly suffocate your opponent. All right, it's test time. You've got the Grandmaster's compass in your hands now. So let's go all the way back to that puzzle from the very beginning. It's Black's turn to move, and they're up a whole knight for just one pawn. If you're just counting the points, this looks like a slam dunk for Black, right? But what does our shiny new compass tell us?
Let's walk through it together, step by step. Number 1, top of the pyramid, king's safety. White's king on c2 is perfectly safe, totally secure. Black's king on g7, a little drafty over there, so advantage white. Okay, number 2, material. This one's easy. A simple count shows Black is up a piece. Advantage Black. Number 3, piece activity. And this is the whole story right here. Take a look at Black's bishop on h8. That piece can never get out. It's a spectator. It's a 3-point piece on paper, but in reality, it's a 0. Meanwhile, look at White's pieces. They're all working together, they're active, they're dangerous. Huge advantage to White. And lastly, structure and space. White's pawns are cramping Black's style, giving White more room to maneuver. Again, advantage White. So, what's the final evaluation when you put it all together? The truth is, despite being down an entire piece, White is completely winning. And this is just the perfect example of why you can't just be an accountant at the chessboard. You have to look at the whole picture. You have to understand the story that the position is telling you.
So here's a question you might have. Does a grandmaster like Noel Suter actually go through this 5-step checklist on every single move he makes? Well, no, not exactly. What happens is, after years and years of practice, this conscious, deliberate process becomes automatic. It becomes intuition. And the secret behind that magic trick is a concept called chunking. Okay, check this out. A beginner looks at a castled king position and they see 5 separate things they have to process. A king here, a rook here, a pawn here, here, and here. But a pro? A pro sees one single thing, standard castled king position. They've seen it thousands upon thousands of times. It's been compressed into one chunk of information in their brain. Here's a great way to think about it. Try to remember this password, AITROFQEBTVAKPD. Impossible, right? It's 15 random things. Now try to remember this one, telephone, banana. Easy. It's just 2 chunks. That's how GMs see the board, not as 32 separate pieces, but as a small handful of familiar patterns and ideas. And this isn't just a theory, it was proven in a really famous study. Scientists showed grandmasters a position from a real chess game for just a few seconds, and they could remember where 93% of the pieces were. Incredible! But then, they showed them a board where the pieces were just placed randomly, in a way that made no chess sense. And suddenly, the Grandmasters were no better at remembering the position than a total beginner. And what that proves is just amazing. High-level chess skill is not about having some magical photographic memory. It's about building a massive internal library of meaningful patterns, of chunks.
So, let's bring it all home. What are the big takeaways here? First, you gotta learn the language. Use algebraic notation. Second, use that 5-step evaluation compass every time you look at a position. King's safety first, then material, piece activity, structure, and space, in that exact order. Third, and this is a big one, drill it into your head that king's safety and how active your pieces are will almost always trump a simple material count. And finally, just know that the more you practice this conscious analysis, the more it will transform into that intuitive, pattern-based vision that all the pros have.
Look, you now have the tools. You have the compass to look at any chess position, cut through all the noise, and find the simple truth. The board isn't just a random jumble of wood and plastic anymore. It's a living landscape of strengths and weaknesses, of threats and opportunities. So, what are you waiting for? Go find some stories.